very, very proud to say that once again our good friend Slash is doing an all-new original score for this maze. Would you like to hear something? Now watch this. I'll jinx myself and then it won't work. But yesterday was Friday the 13th, right?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. If you wouldn't mind, I'll click to the next slide. We're just going to preview one of the tracks that he's doing right now. This is for the very, very beginning of the maze. Let me see if this works. One of the pieces of music that Slash did. Cool. So it's funny, he texted me just maybe 45 minutes ago, and he's on the road with Guns N' Roses. I don't even know what town he's in. And he's like, how's it going? How's it going? You know, what's happening? And I'm like, yeah, I'm about to talk about the bride. So he said to say hi to everybody. Nicest man in the world. The cool thing, even though last year everything that happened and everybody in lockdown, that guy was constantly texting and checking in. How you doing? Are you okay? We're so honored to have him back and working with us again. It's been such a great collaboration. Let's talk about the idea behind this maze. So, obviously there's the movie we talked about, Bride of Frankenstein, 1935, how she's only in 5 minutes or so of that film, and then she gets blown sky high when the monster says, "We belong dead," pulls the switch. And to give credit where credit is due, this idea actually originated with our sister park in Universal Orlando. We were always talking on the phone and comparing notes. and when we were talking about what we might mutually want to do with the Monster franchise moving forward, one of their designers, and his name's Patrick Braillard, a really talented designer. Patrick had the initial idea for this, and some of the other folks in Orlando as well, and immediately Chris and I were like, we're in. This is a great idea. We love the idea of taking a female character, because when you look back in horror history, especially some of the older films, there's not a lot of great female monster characters. The Bride is one of the most iconic ones there is, and she's in it for like this much. And we thought, she deserves her own story. She deserves her own maze. This is the year of the female monster across the board. As we started to get into this, we had the challenge, of course, if you're telling an original story, which this is us creating a sequel, that never existed. In essence, that's what it is. So you have to think about how you do that storytelling-wise in the context of a maze, because a maze is a lot different than a movie or a TV show. We can't just stop and do a bunch of dialogue in the middle of it. It's loud, it's a chaotic environment. Early on, as Chris and I started talking about this, I kept coming back to Mary Shelley's book, from, I believe, 1918, when she wrote the original Frankenstein, which actually included the Bride in it. It is part of the book. And I thought, well, this would be cool if this was like, a book that came out later that nobody knows about. And the other thing that was a big inspiration is an artist named Bernie Wrightson. Do you guys know who Bernie Wrightson is or was? Bernie Wrightson was this amazingly talented illustrator that I had the pleasure of working with in my career at one point. And he did an illustrated version of Frankenstein years ago. And if you get a chance, do yourself a favor and buy this book and check it out. You will never see more beautiful drawings than what Bernie created for this book. So we wanted to kind of combine that idea of a book, and what you're looking at, this is the actual facade for the maze. We created a giant old Victorian book that's open to the title page, and the reason it's a little bit off-center on the side where you see the black and white images is because the door is in the middle. So we wanted the book open to the title page. A lot of books from this era, they would always have this type of layout and artwork. So we wanted you to literally walk into the story, and we wanted to use that idea of a book or chapters as a reoccurring transitional element that we would that you'd encounter as a guest as you walk through the maze, both with imagery, with pictures, with a little bit of writing, and also with voiceover, because in this maze, the bride talks. Just like Frankenstein learned to talk by the Bride of Frankenstein in The Bride of Frankenstein Lives, the bride has learned to talk. And what she's doing is she's telling you this story, and it's probably years, it's much, more into the future, and she's telling the story about what happened. And you're getting to hear that narration as you go through the maze along with the images of the book. So let's zoom in for a closer, and by the way, this is by a very talented artist named Lucas Colshaw. Did you guys go through Holidays in Hell in 2019? Right. Okay, all those amazing postcards and images, the nursery paintings in the nursery scene, that's all Lucas Colshaw. Lucas has been with Chris and I since the very beginning. He's always been our illustrator who does all the character drawings. So we turned Lucas loose, for this maze to do original artwork. So this is the title page, and I'm gonna zoom in on this because I just think, I want this on a t-shirt. Somebody make a t-shirt of this for me. Very much in that same kind of line art style that Bernie did years ago, but that's Lucas's, that's what you'd call a cameo. In Victorian era, there was a lot of paintings that were like this, there were a lot of photographs that were done like this. So this is Lucas's version of a cameo. And if you look at it real close, you get all the little details that relate to the story. There's an Easter egg. So when we did this illustration, Lucas and Chris and I were talking, we're like, God, I feel something's missing. It just feels kind of empty on the bottom. And Lucas goes, well, in those days they would always list the publishers. So I went, oh, okay. So we can have some fun with this. So it's printed in London, printed for Williams, it's Chris Williams. Colshaw, it's Lucas Colshaw. I didn't feel good about putting my last name up there. It just felt wrong, so I changed it to Murdoch. It didn't sound English enough. And then Hudson, that's an inside reference to our good friend Slash, that's his real last name. And then Quinalty is a gentleman named Stacy Quinalty who works with Slash and does all of the, produces all of those tracks that you're hearing. That's also Stacy's work, and he does all of these, in charge of all of the audio for the mazes as well. And then there's the illustration. So this moment captures the end of Bride of Frankenstein, 1935. We belong dead. The monster has just thrown the switch. The explosion's gone off. The castle is starting to crumble, and you can see the bride in the distance. But then when you go into the maze, I'll back up for a second. I mentioned the bride speaks. So in her voice, we hear her out front as you're waiting to go inside. She says, "My story begins where his story ended, but monsters never truly die." So the first thing you see once you walk through the book is the prologue page, which is this image. And the explosion has happened. The bride has survived because she's a monster. She can do that. But the monster has been trapped underneath all this rubble. Huge beams have fallen from the ceiling. Somehow we jumped like 3 slides. Do you want to manually go back, or you want me to? There we go. One more. One more back. There you go. Thank you. It's probably my fault. I probably touched it. And his legs are completely shattered. And she sees him, and the prologue is called "Something Survived." And then she has to make a decision. So, the power of Christ compels you. The power of Christ compels you. There we go. I won't touch it. I'll leave it right here. So she has to make a decision, and the decision is, does she save the monster or not? And she decides to save him, and the reason is because even though she got a little freaked out and screamed at him, he's the only one in her short life that showed him any kindness. So she decides that she has to save him. So this is the first time she finds a voice and says something. You see that prologue image, then you walk inside, and then we reproduce that scene 3-dimensionally for you. You see the monster trapped underneath the huge pillars, and the bride is trying to free him, and she screams primally, and the scream turns into the word dead. So the monster is almost devoid of life at this point. The next chapter is called Saving the Monster, and at this point, you see the bride, and she's got the monster over her shoulder, and she's carrying him through the woods. You can see the smoldering castle away in the distance, but you see something else in the foreground. You see 3 figures. And then the bride in the scene, she goes through 4 different costume iterations and some makeup iterations throughout the course of this maze, because we're telling this story of her adventure from going from the beginning, or I should say the end of Bride of Frankenstein, to her assuming the role as doctor at the end of the maze. So each of these iterations has a different wardrobe touch. So this is her traveling cloak look. You can see by her costume that she's, the whole one side of her costume is badly burned, and her face, she's got this horrible scar from the fire. And she says, "I had to save him, but the world outside the castle walls was full of monsters." And what monsters is that? The Brides of Dracula from 1931. So hovering around the outside of the castle are the Brides of Dracula. Now, we've done the Brides of Dracula. We did them in 2018 for the Universal Monsters Maze. So we're basically treating them like the 31 film, where there's 3 of them. They're almost like sisters, although each of them is going to have a distinct look. So one of them will have red hair, and one of them will have blonde hair, and one of them will be a brunette. But they're all going to be taking off from what we started in 2018. And the bride has to get the monster somewhere, and she doesn't know where she is. She's lost in the woods, but she comes across the ruins of an old cottage that's completely ravaged by fire. And it's a throwback, and there's a couple of throwbacks in this maze, nodding back to 1935 and the classic film Bride of Frankenstein. This is the old blind man's cottage, but he's long gone. It's a charred wreck. As you remember at the end of that scene, it all caught on fire and Frankenstein went running. So she takes the monster here. This is her sanctuary, initially. And if you remember that scene with the old man in Bride of Frankenstein, there's that great scene where he lets him go to sleep in his bed, and he's praying, and there's a cross up on the wall, if you remember that scene from the movie. So this is one of Chris's illustrations, an elevation for the scene where we come in, the monster is laid out on the bed, devoid of life. The cross is missing. You see the burnt imprint of it on the wall. The Bride of Frankenstein is using the cross. So she's trying to protect the monster, and then the vampire brides come busting in, and she uses the cross to repel them, because vampires don't like crosses. And we're building this special effect hand-prop cross that has like burning embers in it and everything, so she can activate it when she does her action in the scene. But then she takes that cross and she sharpens the ends of it and turns it into a cross/stake. And her next iteration is Vampire Hunter. So as the story goes on, the Bride of Frankenstein is constantly being pursued by these vampires, and so she becomes, in essence, a vampire hunter. The name of this chapter is The Hunted Becomes the Hunter. And here you can see her, and she's all vampire monstered out. In fact, this is her costume. So she's got like a leather bandolier with all of these little cross stakes that have been sharpened into vampire stakes. She still has the remnants of her original gown, but it's been shortened. And each time we see her, she takes a different step forward onto her journey of becoming empowered and becoming the Doctor. And at this point, she says, "I hunted them and others like them across the land and across the years, for they held the secret to eternal life." So the Bride of Frankenstein in this maze is trying to figure out what she can do to bring the monster back. And she eventually realizes that the secret to life is in the blood of all these vampires, right? Because vampires live forever. They have eternal life. And like Dracula says in 1931, the blood is life. And so she realizes that she needs to harvest the blood of these vampires in order to bring the monster back to life. So there's a lot of killing that takes place at this point. But we needed a place for her to go to once the cottage is overrun. I think a lot of you guys know I don't live in this country anymore. I live in Ireland. I have since 2017. One advantage to me living in Ireland and going back and forth is I'm always driving around. In Ireland, you can just turn a corner and it's like, oh, look at that, 800-year-old ruined church, and taking pictures, and I'm sending it to Chris all the time. I go to graveyards. I go to graveyards a lot. Take pictures of old graves and go, oh, this would be awesome for this scene. This is an actual cathedral in Ireland, in Dunlewy. What I liked about it is in other pictures you see of it, it's like nature has reclaimed it. It's all covered in vines and it's been standing for centuries. So I gave this as inspiration to Chris because I said, well, if I was the bride and I'm being pursued by vampires and I need to take the monster to a sanctuary that the vampires aren't going to want to go into, it's going to be a church. So this is Chris's elevation of the front of the church, all overgrown with vines. And this is where one of the first vampire bride, or Dracula's bride, bites the dust. Because the bride says, the world hated us, so we left the world behind, but evil soon followed. So even though she thinks she's safe in this church that she's going to turn into her new lab, evil still follows her. But she gets one of them. So these vampire brides have different iterations as well. Each one of them have 3 iterations. This is the staked look. So this particular bride has gotten a stake driven through her heart. She's bleeding out of every orifice on her face, her eyes, her nose, her mouth. And her skin, in this case, is starting to burn and blister. So that's the look of this character. And then when we get inside the church, we hit the next chapter of the story. It's called The Creation Becomes the Creator. Now the Bride of Frankenstein has assumed the role of Dr. Frankenstein. And she's doing all these experiments. She's trying to figure out the secret to eternal life. She's trying to bring the monster back from the dead. And there's all these vials and jars of blood. So she's harvesting the blood of these vampires and pumping it into the monster. And this is the illustration Lucas did for our Doctor version of the bride. And when you first see her in the lab, because this, we had a lab scene in 2018, and this time we went, let's do 2 lab scenes. Why not? So the first time you see her in the lab, when she's got the monster on the table and he's still missing his legs, and she starts pumping all this blood, she's literally draining it out of one of the vampires that she's caught and pumping it into the monster, and there's boiling blood, and there's all of this different kind of lab equipment, but it's a little bit more steam driven because we're a little bit more in the future. Chris did another illustration. This is an elevation of it. It's a lot going on in there. It's a little bit hard to read. But you see the vampire bride with all these tubes hooked up to her, sucking the blood out of her. And you see that they're still in a church, but she set this place up like her lab. Also in this lab, as you get to the end of it, there's cages. And there's vampire brides in the cages. And it's the 2 other ones that we saw at the very beginning. Only now, the Bride of Frankenstein has been doing a lot of experimentation on him. Before she got around to figuring out, oh, it's the blood, she did a lot of exploratory surgery. So one of them we call stitches, and one of them we call crosses. So stitches, she just cut open her head and was like, what's in here? Let's see, let's pull this out. Oh, let me cut another piece. So this one's just part of her hair is missing and she's got stitches all over the place. And the other one was obviously she just didn't want to deal with her and like, stuck the cross up against her forehead and burned it in. And this is where it gets dark, because she's still a monster. As much as we're celebrating and saying we're empowering this character for the first time, she's a monster. Monsters do bad stuff.